Feel the weight in the air before you even understand why. You're still in that room. The smell of wine mixed with bitter herbs still lingers in the room. The flickering light of the oil lamps dances on the stone walls, casting shifting shadows across the faces of the men around them. The floor is cold, made of uneven limestone, exactly as excavations of first-century houses in Jerusalem reveal, where archaeologists have identified upper rooms used for communal meals, similar to the scene of the Last Supper. But something changed, and you feel it before you even understand it. The conversation is over, but no one stands up. Nobody knows exactly what to do, because what was said doesn't fit. He said he was leaving. He said someone there would betray him. He said one of you would deny him. And somehow even more disconcerting, he talked about his body being handed over and his blood being spilled, using bread and wine as if they were symbols of something no one there could fully decipher. But that doesn't make sense. Not now, not after all. You have walked with him for years. He saw the blind see, the dead rise, crowds follow every word. The expectation was always clear, even when it wasn't said out loud. Something big was about to happen, something visible, something powerful, a kingdom. But now, these words don't sound like victory. They sound like goodbye, and it creates a strange silence inside you. Archaeologists discovered that meals like this followed a very specific structure in the first-century Jewish context. Traditional blessings, ritual order, known expectations. Nothing there was improvised. Every gesture had meaning. Every word had a place. But tonight, it went off script. And that is exactly what is destabilizing you, because you recognize the elements: the bread, the wine, the low table, the bodies reclining on cushions. But the meaning has escaped. And that raises a question that no one there has the courage to ask out loud. What if we haven't understood anything so far? But that's not the most disturbing thing. The most unsettling thing is realizing that everyone around you is feeling the same thing. Take a closer look. The faces. Some avoid eye contact. Others seem stuck in thought, trying to mentally organize what they just heard. There is tension in the shoulders, shorter breaths, restrained movements. Nobody is at peace. And this reveals something profound. Their faith still didn't know how to deal with what was happening. Historians estimate that the disciples came from simple backgrounds: fishermen, common workers, men accustomed to concrete reality, not complex symbolic language about death, sacrifice, and spiritual redemption. Evidence suggests that within Jewish culture at the time, the idea of a suffering Messiah was not dominant. What was expected was political liberation, not voluntary surrender. And then, when he talks about death, the brain freezes, because there is no mental category for that. But there is one more layer here, something more subtle. You're not just confused, you are beginning to feel a discomfort that has not yet turned into fear, but is moving in that direction, as if something was about to get completely out of control. And that changes everything, because until now, following him has always meant advancement. Now, it seems like it means loss. And no one there is prepared for that. Nobody. And perhaps most disturbing of all is this: they heard everything, every word, but they couldn't understand what was really being said. And what happens next will only make this confusion even deeper. The words are still echoing in the room, but they don't land on anyone. You listen. but you can't organize it. It is as if Jesus spoke in a language that touches the heart before reaching the mind. The flame of the oil lamps flickers on the low table. The broken bread is still there. The wine still rests in the glasses. The aroma of Easter herbs lingers in the air. Everything in the environment seems familiar. Archaeological evidence shows that festive meals in first-century Jerusalem took place in stone spaces, with cushions next to low tables, ceramic lamps, and limestone utensils associated with ritual purity. The scenario makes sense, but the words, "No, where I'm going, you can't go now. One of you will betray me. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me. This is my body. This is my blood." None of this is in harmony with what you have spent years waiting for, because each sentence seems to pull the floor out of place. He speaks like someone who is in control, but he also speaks like someone who is saying goodbye. And this combination is almost impossible to bear. Take a closer look. The disciples' minds were not empty. It was too full of ancient expectations, images of liberation, promises about the kingdom, hope of restoration for Israel. Scholars estimate that many Jews from Per. The period of the Second Temple fueled the expectation of concrete divine intervention in history, often linked to the defeat of oppressors and the exaltation of God's people. So when Jesus talks about surrender, separation, and shed blood, they don't just find it strange, they collide inside. But that's not all. The problem was not lack of attention. There was an incompatibility between what they heard and what they believed God would do. You try to fit the sentences together. Maybe it's a metaphor. Maybe it's an exaggeration. Perhaps he is speaking of some imminent confrontation and uses harsh imagery to prepare the group, because accepting the most direct meaning would be too devastating. And that's what makes the scene so human. No one there is ready to correctly interpret something that contradicts their deepest hope. Excavations reveal that the Easter context further intensified this tension. Easter was not just a religious meal. It was a living memory of liberation, alliance, blood, exodus, divine intervention. And precisely on that night, Jesus takes known symbols and repositions them around himself. This changes everything, because he is not just explaining what will happen. He is redefining history before them. And the disciples, sitting a few steps away from him, still cannot realize that they heard the beginning of a rupture that would only make sense after the pain. Now, the confusion is no longer just in the environment. It is inside each one. You look around the room and realize that silence does not mean unity. It means fragmentation. Everyone heard the same words, everyone felt the same weight, but no one is processing it in the same way. This is where the scene becomes even more human, because the crisis does not descend on the group as a single block. It spreads unevenly, touching each disciple at a different point. Some react on impulse. Others close themselves inside. Others still try to appear strong precisely because they are starting to fall apart. Watch Peter. He can't stand the idea of separation, does not support the possibility of failure. So he reacts as many react when the truth threatens his self-image. He speaks louder than he feels. Pledge loyalty before understanding the scenario. His confidence seems like strength, but it already carries nervousness. Evidence suggests that in contexts of imminent crisis, intense affirmations of fidelity often function as a psychological defense against fear. Pedro is not just being brave, he is trying to push the dread away with his own words. But John seems different. quieter, more attentive to tone than logic. He feels the emotional weight of the night, even without capturing the entire structure of what Jesus is announcing. There are people who perceive the atmosphere before understanding the facts. And perhaps in that room, John was already absorbing the sadness on Jesus' face before he even understood the full meaning of his words. And then there is Judas, sitting close enough to continue pretending normality, close enough to still be included in the gesture of the meal. Archaeologists discovered that sharing bread at the same table in the first century Jewish world was a profound sign of bond and trust. This makes everything even more disturbing. The betrayal would not come from a distant enemy, but from within intimacy. And this possibility, even without being fully named by everyone, already contaminates the air. But look closer, because this raises another question. And the others? Thomas may be trying to rationally organize what he heard. Matthew may be observing every detail, trying to find a hidden logic. Andre may feel the tension growing without being able to translate it. Philip, James, Bartholomew, real men with different internal rhythms, all affected in a unique way by the same night. This is what many forget. The disciples were not an emotional choir. They were different men with different stories, reacting in different ways to the collapse of what they thought they understood. Scholars estimate that itinerant groups like Jesus's developed strong social cohesion, but this did not erase individual temperaments. On the contrary, in moments of pressure, differences emerged even more strongly. And that's exactly what happens here. The table remains the same. The light keeps shaking. But inside, everyone has already started to lose themselves in their own way. And the most dangerous thing is that no one there yet realizes that this confusion is not the end of stability. It's just the beginning of the rupture. This is where the night begins to break something much deeper than the tranquility of the room. It wasn't just their understanding that was failing. It was the very expectation of the future. You need to feel it like they felt it. For months, perhaps years, hope took shape within them. Each miracle seemed to confirm. Every gathered crowd seemed to announce. Each confrontation with religious authorities seemed to push the story towards an unexpected climax. Idle. The kingdom was coming. Restoration was near. The Messiah was there. But now, in that room lit by small clay lamps, everything begins to crack. Archaeological evidence shows that first-century Herodian lamps, found in Jerusalem and Judea, produced a low, warm, unstable light. Nothing that night would have the clarity of a majestic hall. The environment was intimate, cramped, vulnerable. And that matters because the scene does not match political triumph. There is no sword raised. There is no coronation. There is no military strategy. There is broken bread. There is spilled wine. There are phrases that sound more like delivery than achievement. And that is the breaking point, because the disciples were not listening to Jesus from a neutral place. They heard everything through the filter of hope they had already built. When he talked about kingdom, they still imagined visible reversal of power. When he talked about greatness, it was still difficult to separate it from honor, position, recognition. Scholars estimate that in Second Temple Judaism, many messianic expectations were linked to national liberation, public justice, and the end of humiliation under foreign domination. So, when Jesus starts talking like someone who is going to suffer, be handed over, disappear for a while, It doesn't just confuse, this contradicts. And human beings almost always resist what contradicts their hope more than what challenges their logic. But here's what changes everything. The problem wasn't that they didn't love Jesus. The problem is that they still loved the version of the future they had projected about him. And this revelation is uncomfortable, because following the victorious Messiah was one thing. Following a Messiah who wins by being crushed was quite another. Look closer. Maybe that's why the words weren't coming. Maybe that's why no one could organize the night. They were not just faced with a spiritual mystery, they were facing the collapse of an emotional expectation. Their hearts had built a path, and Jesus was revealing another, a path of humiliation before glory, of rupture before redemption, from the cross before the visible kingdom. And this explains what many modern readers miss. The disciples were not blind for lack of intelligence. They were disoriented because the reality of God was arriving through a door they never wanted to open, and in the next few hours, this dissonance between what they expected and what they would see will become unbearably real. Fear does not enter that night like a scream. He enters slowly, first, like a tightness in the chest that no one knows how to name. Then, like the nagging feeling that Jesus' words weren't just difficult, they were dangerously real. You feel it in the change in the air, in the way the conversation loses heat, in the way eyes begin to look for reassurance in each other and don't find it. The room is still the same. The table is still set. But inside, something began to collapse. And this is the moment when confusion becomes a threat. Archaeological evidence shows that in first century Jerusalem, nighttime gatherings by the light of small oil lamps created low visibility environments with strong shadows and heightened sensory perception. In a space like this, every pause feels bigger, every silence weighs more. Each unresolved sentence remains suspended in the environment. And now, Jesus' words no longer just sound mysterious, they start to sound irreversible. You will stumble. I'm going where you can't go now. Tonight. Tonight. Not some distant day, not in a parable to be deciphered later. Tonight. And this is what triggers the first clear sign of fear, the perception of proximity. Whatever's going on, it's not far away, it's coming. But there is something even more human here. When people can't control the scenario, they start holding on to small certainties. Pedro clings to his own courage. Others cling to the physical presence of Jesus, as if the mere fact of still being in the same room could impede what he is announcing. Scholars estimate that in situations of collective tension, strongly cohesive groups tend to oscillate between denial and hyper-affirmation of loyalty. This explains why, just when the ground starts to give way, such intense promises emerge. But that doesn't solve it, because fear has already started to change the way they listen. Now, every sentence seems to have a shadow. Every gesture seems to hide a farewell. Every mention of the match opens a void that no one knows how to fill. And this is where it shifts. Until just a few hours ago, following Jesus seemed like walking toward some glorious revelation. Now it starts to feel like exposure, risk, loss. And this detail changes everything, because fear is not just born from an external threat. It is born from the internal collapse of what sustained you inside. They haven't run yet. They haven't denied it yet. They haven't dispersed yet. But the first signs are already there. Tension, self-protection, misunderstanding, instability. The fall hasn't happened yet, But in that room, their hearts already began to tremble. What they lacked was not hearing. It was an interior structure. You need to look at this night from the most painful angle of all. The disciples heard the right words from the right mouth at the most decisive moment, and still they couldn't put the pieces together. Betrayal, denial, separation, death, delivery, love until the end, kingdom, glory, resurrection hinted at. Everything has been said, but nothing yet formed a complete picture within them, and this is more human than it seems, because there is a difference between hearing a truth and having enough soul to bear it. In that room, surrounded by stone walls and lit by small flames fed by oil, Jesus did not speak about isolated topics. He was revealing a sequel. Archaeological evidence shows that first-century domestic environments in Jerusalem were compact, with closed acoustics and minimal lighting, which made each spoken word carry even more weight in the space. And yet, the problem wasn't a lack of sonic clarity. It was too much emotional disruption. How to unite in a single vision that the Master would be delivered and at the same time would be fulfilling the Father's will. How could we accept that the man who opened blind eyes now spoke like someone willingly walking to be crushed? How can we understand that their loyalty would be tested to the point of flight, and yet that wouldn't mean the end of everything? But that's not all. The deepest thing here is that they tried to interpret the night using categories that were too old. They knew what victory was. They knew what deliverance was. They knew what honor was. But they still didn't know what to do with a redemption that would first tread through suffering. Scholars estimate that the disciples' difficulty reflected not only personal limitation, but the clash between current messianic expectations and the unexpected way in which Jesus embodied his mission. And when the mind cannot integrate reality, it fragments. One part listens, another refusal. One part feels the danger. Another insists on maintaining some normality. This is why they seem so close to Jesus and yet so far from what he is saying. Look closer. They were not fake. They weren't cold. They were not unbelievers in the simple sense. They were overwhelmed by a revelation too great for the spiritual stage in which they still found themselves. And perhaps that's what makes this scene so devastating. They loved Jesus, but they still could not understand the way of Jesus. They heard the announcement of the fall, but they did not understand that redemption was already in motion. They heard about loss, not realizing that God was preparing fulfillment. They heard the night coming, without imagining that dawn would come on the other side of what terrified them most. And that's exactly where this story stops being just them and starts touching you. Now the scene is no longer just in that room. She started to reach out to you, because if you're honest, this mess isn't strange to you. You've also been in moments when you've heard something important, a direction, a truth, a change, but haven't been able to fully process it. Not because I didn't want to, but because at that moment you still didn't have the structure to understand. And that's exactly what's happening there. The disciples are not just old characters, they are a mirror. Have you ever noticed how often we only hear what fits within what we already believe? How do we filter deep words through expectations we don't even realize we have? That night, they listened to Jesus, but they interpreted everything through the idea of a future that made sense to them. And that changes everything. Because the problem was never a lack of revelation. It was too much of an expectation. Archaeological evidence shows that first-century Jewish culture was profoundly shaped by oral repetition. Teachings were memorized, recited, internalized from childhood. This means that the disciples were accustomed to hearing, retaining, and transmitting words accurately. In other words, they did not forget what Jesus said. They just couldn't understand it at the right time. And that raises an uncomfortable question. How many things have you heard, but still don't understand? But here's what changes everything. Maybe you're waiting for complete clarity before moving forward. Maybe you're trying to organize every detail before trusting. Maybe you're looking for reassurance before taking the next step. And without realizing it, you are doing exactly what they did, trying to fit what God is showing you into what you already consider possible. But the truth is that understanding often comes later, after the tension, after loss of control, after the moment when everything seems disconnected. Look closer. That night, the disciples did not receive full explanations. They were fragments. And these fragments would only make sense when they were crossed by pain, by absence, by real fear, and finally, by the revelation that would come later. And it confronts something inside you because you also want to understand first. But what if some things in your life only make sense later? Scholars estimate that processes of profound transformation, both spiritual and emotional, rarely happen through immediate understanding. They go through phases of confusion, resistance, and reinterpretation. And this is not a failure, it's process. And perhaps that's exactly where this story connects with you most directly. You are not lost because you didn't listen. You are in the middle of something that you have not yet fully understood. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. It means you're in a night that hasn't ended yet. And perhaps this is the hardest part to accept. That night, their faith was real, but it was still immature in the face of what was happening. They loved Jesus. They had left a lot to follow him. They had seen miracles, heard truths that no one else said, felt the weight of his authority. But even so, in the hours after the Last Supper, they still didn't know how to name what they were experiencing. They failed to realize that confusion was not the end of faith. It was the place where superficial faith began to die. And it goes deeper than it seems. Because you too can love God and still not understand the season you are living in. You may be hearing true words, receiving direction, feeling that something has changed in the air, and yet still not have complete clarity. Like them, you can try to interpret everything from what you wanted to happen, and not from what God is actually building. And that's where the heart gets lost. Not out of open rebellion, but for insisting on expecting one type of answer while heaven is preparing another. Archaeologists discovered that in the first century Jewish world, Passover meal nights carried memory, expectation, and collective identity. But on this particular night, what was being prepared was not just a memory of ancient liberation. It was the journey to a liberation that no one in that room could yet measure. And maybe that's why this story remains so alive. Because she doesn't just talk about confused disciples. It talks about you when God is acting and you still call it silence. It talks about you when the sky is rearranging everything and you think you're losing control. It talks about you when the night seems incomprehensible, but is already pregnant with redemption. So keep this in mind. Not all confusion means absence of God. Sometimes it just means you haven't seen the full picture of what He is doing. If this video spoke to you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. And I want to ask you something honestly. In what area of your life do you feel like you've heard God, but still can't understand what He's doing?